very, very much. So it is 2014 you are here at Management Center for Human Values. I just released that experience of, listening to you. So many people in India know you. You are a regular visitor and you keep delivering talks. So Mary C. Gentile is the creator, director of Giving Voice to Values. She is right now the Richard M. Wedger Bicentennial Professor of Ethics at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business. She is also the Senior Advisor at the Aspen Institute Business and Society Program, also a consultant on management education and leadership development. She is called as the practical ethicist in compliance with 2017 Top Minds Awards. She is author of she is actually the authority of the value-driven leadership. And she has written that award-winning book, Giving Voice to Values. And there are curriculums about 1,000 in 1,000 such business schools who teach that book, like in that course, Giving Voice to Values. She has also written many other books like Educating for Values-Driven Leadership, Managerial Excellence Through Diversity, Can Ethics Be Taught, co-authored by somebody else. So she's, as I said, she's the authority of giving voice to values. And there are many cases that she has written and guided many of us to write on giving voice to values. So she can sort of, tell us how in difficult situations we can make through the way to achieve that standards of ethics and give voice to our values. Mary, the floor is open to you. And
thank you.
Looking forward.
Thank you so much, Nisigandha. And yes, I was there at the Indian Institute of Management in Calcutta in 2014, but actually my very first trip to India was to the Management Center for Human Values at IIM Calcutta in 2001. So it was 20 years ago. And it was my very first trip to India. I've been to India many times since, all over, but I have such fond memories of spending a week with the Management Center for Human Values program. And it was my introduction to your wonderful country. So it's a sort of an honor to be able to come back and speak again at the center and in honor of your Diamond Jubilee. So thank you so much for inviting me. What I want to do today is to talk about what you introduced, to talk about giving voice to values, or GVV, as I sometimes refer to it. It's a innovative approach to values-driven leadership development. And I actually created it for use in MBA programs, graduate business education, because that's where I was working. I worked for 10 years at Harvard Business School, where I helped to design and teach their first required curriculum around values and leadership and ethics. And then I was 5 years at Babson College in Boston, which is ranked #1 in the world for entrepreneurship. And now I've been 6 years at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business. And that's where I've found a permanent home for giving voice to values and for the curriculum and the work. And I created it because I was frustrated with the way we were teaching about ethics and values in business schools, especially in graduate business education. But it's actually grown well beyond that now. It's used in executive education and undergraduate education. It's being used in companies all over the world. We've worked with Lockheed Martin, we've worked with Unilever, we've worked with McKinsey, we've worked with KPMG, we've worked with a lot of major companies. We've also worked with smaller companies. And now we're beginning to work with other professions. So healthcare, nursing and medicine, the law, engineering. I'm actually right now working with a group of authors to create a set of curricular materials around giving voice to values and ethics issues in technology. So it's grown beyond its original roots. But what I want to do today is to just spend a little bit of time telling you some stories about why I created it, what it is, why it works, and maybe give you an idea of how you might tap into it in your own lives. But, I know it's hard to listen to people talking for a long time on Zoom. So I'm going to just tell you what the punchline is, what the bottom line is right now. So if at any point your day's out, you still know where I'm going. So the main point that I hope you remember, if you remember nothing else from what I'm going to say today, I hope you remember this, that giving voice to values is about asking and answering a new question, a different question when it comes to values and ethics and leadership in our organizational and professional lives and in our wider lives, our personal lives as well. So the typical question that we tend to ask and try to answer is, what is the right thing to do in any particular situation? That's a good question. And is, I'm sure, one that you've thought about. But giving voice to values is about asking and answering a different question. It's about asking the question, once you know what you believe the right thing to do is in any situation, how can you get it done effectively? What do you need to say and do? What will the objections be? What will the pushback be? And then what will you say and do? And what kind of information or data do you need to gather? And do you need to do this alone? Is this a one-off conversation? Or do you need to build a set of allies, a kind of coalition? And is this just, one decision? Or is this more of a systemic issue? If it's a systemic issue across the organization, across the region, across the culture, across the profession or industry, then you need to address it systemically. But that still means there's a role for individual action, because systemic processes are a series of individual actions. It just means you need to think more creatively, more incrementally sometimes, more long-term, and more strategically. So giving voice to values is not about preaching. It's not about philosophy. It's not about deciding, what would the philosophers say is the right thing to do. It's more about actually, once you know what's right, how can I create an action plan and a script to persuade others, to influence others? So if you don't remember anything else, please remember that I'm inviting you to ask a different question when you encounter values conflicts. But now I'm going to just take a step back and tell you a little bit about why I developed it and the research it's based on and why and how it works. So I like to tell people that giving voice to values, it grew out of my own crisis of faith. I became very disillusioned. I became very discouraged because I'd been working in the field of ethics education in business for several decades. And I began to feel that maybe at best it's futile and at worst it's kind of hypocritical. And I began to feel that way for a number of reasons. First of all, it seemed that every few years there would be a spate of scandals that would hit the business press. And if you happened to be working in a business school, as I was, when these scandals would hit the press, we would all become concerned. We would get letters from the alumni who were worried about the devaluing of the brand, because it was usually graduates from these business schools who were on the front pages of the newspapers as the architects of these various kinds of scandals, and there would be articles in the business press saying, what the heck are they teaching in business schools? Because look at what they're doing. And so if you happen to be teaching in a business school, as I was, when these scandals would hit, we would create committees, we would create task forces. And this happened multiple times throughout my career because there were multiple scandals. But the committees would look at the curriculum, they would interview faculty and students and alumni and recruiters, and they would try to understand what is it that we're teaching and why aren't people behaving more ethically in the workplace. And so we would do all the research, and then we would create new courses, we would start new research, we might hire some new faculty, and we would send out press releases announcing our new initiatives on ethics and business. And then a few years later, the whole cycle would start again. And this had happened several times. And so it was very discouraging. But the second reason for my crisis of faith was actually a little more personal. I remember this was in the late 90s, I think, and I was invited by a friend of mine who ran something called the Markula Center for Professional Ethics at Santa Clara University in California in the US. And he was deciding to host a debate. And he was going to have two people on one side of the debate who were arguing that after 25 years, a quarter of a century of good faith efforts to address ethics and values in business education, that we'd made a huge amount of progress. And then he wanted to have two people on the other side of the debate arguing that we hadn't made any progress. And he asked me to be on the side of the debate arguing that we'd made a lot of progress. On the negative side, he had Milton Friedman's son, who happened to be a sociologist. I'm sure you're familiar with Milton Friedman, the economist. So anyways, I sat down to write my remarks for this debate. And I had this moment where I thought, can I lie on an ethics panel? Because I really wasn't sure if I could honestly say that we had made a lot of progress. So I ended up writing something that was a little more nuanced. You know, I said something like, any of us who are educators or who are managers, we know that there are individuals that we've influenced. But if I were going to speak more broadly, I really couldn't say that we'd made the kind of impact that we wanted to make. That wasn't exactly what my host had hoped I would say, but it was what I could say honestly. And that was kind of a watershed moment for me, because I thought, gee, I've been doing this for a long time. Is this really the best I can say? So that was quite discouraging. But then the final reason for my crisis of faith was what I actually saw in the classrooms or in companies when I went in to speak to them about ethics and values in business. And it was this, that typically we would give people some case study, some thorny ethical dilemma, and we'd ask them to read it. And then they would come into the room, the training session or the classroom, and they would have an idea of what they thought the right thing to do was. But then as we discussed it in the course of the discussion, two things would happen. The first thing that would happen is that their thinking would become more complex. They'd begin to think, well, maybe I didn't have all the information. Or maybe this is sort of standard operating procedure in this company or in this industry or in this part of the world. Or maybe it is wrong, but you know, if I try to do something about it, I'm not likely to be effective. I might even make it worse, at least for myself. And so all of their thinking would become more complex. I think that's a good thing. You don't want people to walk into these situations naively. But the second thing that would happen was more concerning to me. It was this. I don't know if you have this experience in your organizations or in your classrooms, but typically I would find that there'd be one or two people that when they spoke, everyone would turn to listen to them. You know, maybe they were the most articulate. Maybe they were the ones who always had a good story to illustrate their point. Maybe they were the wittiest. They always had something humorous to say around their arguments. When I'm in a corporate setting, they were usually the person of the highest rank. But whatever it was, when those people spoke, the ones that everyone listened to, they were usually the ones who were voicing the most skeptical, if not cynical positions. They were usually the ones who were saying, you know, I know what you want me to say, Mary, but in the real world, it's just not possible. So I was thinking, gee, you know, people are walking out of these discussions, these classrooms or these training sessions, they're walking out more confused and less empowered. And so I thought, you know, is that really the way I want to spend my time? Is that useful? And I was very discouraged. And I decided I'm going to take a step back from this work. I mean, life is short. I want to do something that matters. So I decided I would do something else. And in that time period, when this was the late 90s, I had a number of experiences that led to the creation of Giving Voice to Values. I'm just going to tell you about a couple of them. So one of them was, I was looking for other things to do, and I got a consulting assignment for Columbia Business School in New York City. And I was working on a project for them. And while I was there were a group of faculty, about 4 or 5 faculty, senior faculty in finance and economics and accounting and government relations. And they were all still looking at this issue of how do we teach about values and ethics in business. And they had come up with this idea. It was their idea, not mine, to ask all of the students upon matriculation, when they were joining the class during orientation, to answer one question. And this was the question: tell us about a time in your work experience so far when you were explicitly told or implicitly pressured to do something that conflicted with your own values, and how you handled it. So they asked all the students to write just a paragraph or two about a little example that they'd had experienced. They didn't have to put their names on it. They didn't have to name the organizations. But so they gathered all these stories, and then they came to me and they said, Mary, we know you used to work on these issues when you were at Harvard Business School, and we're trying to figure out what to do with these stories. Would you be willing to read them and give us your thoughts? So I said, sure. So I read hundreds and hundreds of these, well over 1,000 over several years, and they were really interesting. So let me tell you what we learned from these stories. So the first thing we learned is, if you think about the kinds of people who get a graduate business degree at a school like Columbia Business School, it's in New York City. So there's certain industries that are more heavily represented than others. So there's a lot of people from the big consulting firms. There's a lot of people from the financial sector. There's a good number of people from the big pharmaceutical companies, because so many of the multinational pharmaceutical firms have headquarters in the tri-state area. There's a good number of high tech. So because certain industries were more heavily represented, the kinds of stories these people told got repetitious pretty quickly. You know, they all had, you know, on average, maybe 2, 3, 4 years of work experience. And they talked about things like, you know, I was pressured to inflate or deflate my billable hours in a way that didn't really correspond with the work I was doing. Or I was told to adjust or tamper with the equations or the benchmarks that I used to evaluate the relative attractiveness or lack of attractiveness of a particular financial transaction in order to encourage our clients to take the action that would maximize revenue for our firm. Or I was encouraged to exaggerate the capabilities of a product, whether it was a new piece of software or a new pharmaceutical product, beyond what our research could really prove, in order to maximize sales revenues. Or they talked about being pressured to engage in various forms of corruption, facilitating payments in order to gain access to certain markets, or in order to compete for certain RFPs. And then there were always the human resource issues around hiring and firing and fairness, discrimination. So the stories they told got repetitious pretty quickly. What was interesting is that their solutions, their responses differed, and their responses fell into several recognizable buckets. So the first bucket, the largest bucket, a little less than half of them said, yes, I had a conflict, I had a values conflict, and it bothered me. It didn't just roll off my back, but I really didn't think I had any options. And so these people just said, I'll just suck it up and do what they tell me to do. I don't feel like I have a choice. That was the largest group. And then there was a small group who said, yes, this bothered me. It bothers me so much that I can't bring myself to do it. But these people also didn't think they had any real options. And so these people chose to remove themselves from the situation. So some of them got themselves transferred to a different manager or a different work group. And a few of them even quit their jobs. But this was a small group. And now the remainder of the whole group, so we're talking about a third of them now, said, yes, I had this conflict, and I tried to do something about it. And a small group of them said, I tried and I failed. But about a quarter of the whole group said, I tried, and by my lights, I was successful. So we thought, well, what's different here? They all recognize the issues. They all are concerned about the issues. And yet so many of them don't feel like they have a choice. And then some of them are able to do something successfully. So we were wondering, what can we learn from these stories? It wasn't really empirical research. It was just self-reporting, but we thought it was interesting. And so we decided to look more closely. So we brought in a researcher to kind of slice and dice the stories and look for themes, look for patterns. And in the end, she couldn't say that one group was more morally troubled than the other group, because by definition, I didn't give them a scenario and you think it's wrong, but you didn't think it was such a big deal. It was something where they said it bothered them. And yet some of them were not able to act and some of them were. So that didn't seem to be the distinction. And it didn't seem that one group was more organizationally sophisticated, more politically savvy than the other group. Because yes, there were some who found very creative, innovative solutions, win-wins, if you will. But some of them were kind of clumsy and even naive in the way they solved the problems. And so that didn't seem to be the distinction. So in the end, the only thing we could say is that the people who were able to do this effectively at some point said something outside of their own heads. And it might have started by talking to a spouse or a partner or a friend, but eventually it found its way into the organization and changed the trajectory of things. So when I heard that, I got discouraged again. I got disappointed. I thought, well, what do you do with that? I was hoping for some really interesting little tool or lever or idea for how to help people act on their values more effectively. And I really wasn't sure what to do with this insight that, well, they said something, But then I remembered some research that I had seen years earlier when I was still at Harvard Business School. It was 2 different studies by 2 different scholars, Douglas Hunneke and Perry London, and they both decided independently that they wanted to study people who had acted on their values in times of really high risk, really high stakes. And so they both decided independently they were going to do qualitative research. They were going to do in-depth interviews with people who had acted in this way. And they both decided that the population they would interview would be people who are often referred to as rescuers from World War II. So these are people who put their lives at stake to help others who were endangered during the Holocaust. And so they found some of these people and they did these interviews and they tried to identify, what kind of personal experience, family background, educational, religious, political background, what did they have in common that enabled them to act this way when so many others did not? And what they found a set of characteristics, but the one that really resonated with me, probably because I was an educator, is that they said that the people who acted this way all reported that at an earlier point in their lives, usually as a young adult, they had had the experience with someone more senior to them. So a teacher, a boss, a manager, a mentor, even a parent. They'd had the experience of that person saying, what would you do if? And then various kinds of moral conflicts. And then they had the opportunity to script and practice what they would say and do. Now, of course, they couldn't have anticipated the Holocaust, but they did have this experience at both the intellectual or cognitive level and also the behavioral level. So at the cognitive level, they had the experience of naming the values that matter to them and putting a set of words to them, an articulation, and a kind of script. And at the behavioral level, they had the experience of literally voicing these positions out loud to someone more senior. Oops. To someone more senior to them who stood in as proxy for the kind of person that they might need to speak with in the actual circumstances. So there was this idea of pre-scripting and rehearsal and peer coaching. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So I thought, let's take a look at the research. So I started doing 2 kinds of exploration. The first was I started gathering more stories of people who had encountered values conflicts and asking them, how did they act on them? What did they say and do? What enabled them to say and do what they did? But the other kinds of exploration I did was to look at the research. And this was about 10 or 12 years ago. There was starting to be a lot of research in a number of disciplines, there's more now, that suggests that this idea of rehearsal is a very important and a very effective way to influence behavior. So there was research in the field of psychology. You might have seen some of the research around habit formation, for example, or there's a whole group of scholars in psychology who study what's called positive deviance. These are people who study individuals who deviate from the norm but in a positive direction. And they have a really nice phrase. This is their phrase, not mine. They say, if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more impactful to have them act their way into a different way of thinking. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And then there was a lot of research coming out in the field of cognitive neurosciences. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I spoke with folks who were familiar with this kind of research. You've probably read about some of it, where they're researching about brain plasticity and about creating new neural pathways, new behavioral patterns. But the research I'm going to tell you about actually comes from the field of kinesthetics, or the study of physical movement. So I'm going to tell you a little story. I told you that I was working at Harvard Business School a number of years ago. And when I was there, I decided that I think I need to take a self-defense class. And I started to look around Boston, and there were a lot of these classes. They all teach pretty much the same thing. They teach you the physical moves to defend yourself. So they teach you, fist to bridge of nose, and heel to instep, and knee to groin. And you practice these moves in the air. And the idea is now that if anyone ever attacked me, I would know what to do, right? But there was one class that was different. It was called model mugging. And it was a developmental model. So they would still teach you all these physical moves, and you'd rehearse them in the air. But then once you knew the moves, they'd bring in a gentleman in a padded suit, sort of like the Michelin Man, if you remember him. And they would line us all up, and we would take turns getting attacked by this gentleman. And you could use the moves you had learned on him full force because he was protected. And in the beginning, it was kind of ludicrous because you just stood there waiting your turn to get attacked, right? But as the class went on, week after week, I might be talking to you over here, and he would come and grab me from the other direction. I never knew when. I never knew what hold he was going to use. It was utterly nerve-wracking. But the idea behind it, which they explained to us, and those of you who are athletes will be familiar with this, the idea behind it was this research on what's called specific state muscle memory. So the idea is, if you rehearse something in the same physiological and emotional and intellectual state that you'll be in when you need to use it, that even if you freeze in the moment, your body remembers. So for example, the tennis pro will practice her serve over and over before she goes to the tournament, so that when she's there under all that pressure, her body just naturally assumes the proper form. And so I was in this class one day, and I was lying on my back on the floor because I had failed to protect myself. And I was thinking, could you create a kind of moral muscle memory? Could you create a default to voice? Not just to speaking up, because one of the things I was learning from all those stories I was collecting is that the people who did this, it was not usually a matter of going to their boss and telling him or her that they were wrong or they were evil. It was not usually, sort of shaking your fist and speaking truth to power. It was more often something much more strategic, much more nuanced, much more tactical. And so it was more like a default to informed voice. Because the other thing I was learning is that the kinds of objections that we encounter when we try and voice our values, I call them the reasons and rationalizations. Those things can be kind of predictable. There's a pattern. You hear them over and over again, and they're powerful, but they're not bulletproof. And the thing is that you need to think in advance how you might respond to them, because they're powerful in the moment. They're things like, it's not a big enough deal to worry about. We won't worry about it now. Or this is just standard operating procedure. It's just the way everyone does it. Or it's I'm going to wait for mute.
Yeah, I did it.
There we go. Or it's above my pay grade. It's not my responsibility. It's my boss's responsibility. Those are the kinds of things that we hear. And so, they're powerful. And it's very difficult to think about how to respond to them in the moment. But the idea is, can we rehearse? Can we practice? Can we think in advance? Can we unpack them? Because they are predictable. They come up again and again. And so that was kind of the idea behind this. Can we think about how do we actually rehearse and practice? So then I went back and thought, well, okay, this is an interesting idea, this idea of pre-scripting and rehearsal and peer coaching, creating this new moral muscle memory. So I went back to look at what do we actually do when we teach about business ethics in business schools, or when we train about it in our companies. And then I got discouraged again. I went back to my crisis of faith, because what we typically do, and what I did, I mean, we all did it in good faith, was that we try and teach people awareness. We try and expose them to a lot of scenarios so they would recognize the ethical challenges when they occur. It's an important thing to do because, you know, we live in a world where business is global, and the kinds of issues you might encounter in one region, in one part of the world, may be different in another part of the world. And also we live in a world where technology is, you know, advancing so rapidly. So the kinds of challenges we face keep changing. You know, there's challenges in artificial intelligence. There's challenges in protecting privacy and information security. There's challenges in ransomware, for example. There's all these kinds of challenges that are new. So building awareness is good, but it's not enough, because just because we're aware of issues doesn't mean that we know how to act on them. And then the second thing we would do is we would teach analysis. And what we meant by that is we're going to teach you ways of thinking about these issues so you can think rigorously and consistently. So if you're in a company, we would teach you the relevant rules, the laws, the company code of ethics, the regulations, the company values. If we're in an academic setting, we might teach you the tools of reasoning that come from philosophy. So we would teach you about utilitarianism or deontology or virtue ethics. In another setting, you might learn about the guidelines from various religious traditions. So you would learn these guidelines, and then we would give you scenarios, and we'd say, is this over the line or not? Is this okay? Is this right? Or is this wrong? Again, this is it's a necessary thing to do, because we do want to think consistently. We don't want to assume that just because I think it's right or wrong that you're going to agree. We want to think seriously about this. But again, it's not sufficient, because just because you can think clearly doesn't mean you know how to act. In fact, I remember interviewing a guy. He was a CEO and an entrepreneur, and he told me the story. He said that he had been interviewing an individual who had just graduated from one of the top MBA programs, graduate business programs in the United States. And he was interviewing him for a high potential position in his company. And the CEO asked this graduate, he said, did you take an ethics class in your MBA program? And the gentleman said, well, yes, it was required. And so the CEO said, well, what did you learn? And the guy said, well, I learned all the models of ethical reasoning, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics. And then I learned that whenever you encounter a values conflict, you should decide what you want to do. And then you should select the model of ethical reasoning that will best support what you want to do. Now, of course, this wasn't what the professor was hoping this gentleman would walk away with. And the CEO who was telling me this story was sort of teasing me, right? Because I was the ethics lady, you know, but there's a lot of truth to this comment, because these models of ethical reasoning conflict. That's actually why they're valuable, because what you can see from a rules-based position, you might not see from a utilitarian perspective. So it helps you think more clearly, but they don't tell you what's right. And then once you've decided what's right, they certainly don't tell you how to get it done. And so used poorly, this focus on analysis can become a kind of schooling for sophistry. It can kind of teach you how to rationalize anything. And so that's not the intention, but that can be the outcome, as we saw from that story. So I decided we do need to teach awareness, we do need to teach analysis, but we need to add the third A, we need to teach action. And to do that, we needed to create a different kind of pedagogy, a different kind of teaching technology. So I went back and, you know, when I was working at Harvard Business School, I used to run their case writing program. So I hired 60 plus case writers in all the disciplines: finance, operations, human resources, marketing, everything. And I would train them. And I also wrote a lot of cases that were bestsellers. And so I was very familiar with that method. And I'm sure most of you are as well. The case study method, which is, a story. It's usually 10 or 15 pages long. It usually features the CEO. And at the end of the case, the CEO will look out the window and say, what should I do? And then the students or the employees will discuss it for 90 minutes. And this is a great way to teach awareness and analysis, but it does not teach action. So I decided we needed to develop a different kind of teaching tool. So we created what we call the Giving Voice to Values Thought Experiment, the GVV Thought Experiment. They are still scenarios, they're case-based. They're much shorter than a traditional case study. Often they're just a page or two. Sometimes they're a few pages. They feature people at every level in the organization, not just the CEO, because as we learned from those stories of the Columbia students, those were people who'd only been working for 2 or 3 years, and they already had all these examples. So they feature people at every level. But the big difference between a traditional case study and a Giving Voice to Values thought experiment is that our scenarios end with a protagonist, a main character, who has already decided what he or she thinks the right thing to do is. And the question becomes, how could they be effective? What do they need to say? To whom? In what sequence? And what will the pushback be? What kinds of objections will they encounter? And then what would they say? And what kinds of data do they need to gather? And is this something that they need to do alone? Or is this something where they need to build a set of allies? And is this a one-off situation or a systemic issue? And how will they frame an action plan depending on their answers to those questions? And so our questions, as I say, it's not asking you, what would you do? I would never ask, what would you do? Because we know from the research now that when we encounter values conflicts, we tend to react emotionally. The psychologists call it an intuitive response. We tend to react emotionally, automatically, unconsciously. We do what we feel we can do. And then afterwards, post hoc, we rationalize why it was the right thing to do or why it might be the only thing we could do. And so if we don't want to trigger that automatic self-protective measure, this is not because we're intending to be bad or evil or wrong. It's just because we're trying to protect ourselves from living in that space of cognitive dissonance when you know something's wrong and you do it anyway. So instead, you act emotionally, automatically, and then you rationalize after the fact why it was okay, why it was right. And so I don't want to ask, what would you do? Because I would trigger that kind of response in all of us. So instead, we ask, what if you were this person who thinks this is what the right thing to do is? How could they get it done? So what this does is it creates this kind of safe space, this sort of laboratory where we can think more creatively. We know from the research that we're more innovative and creative when we don't feel as pressured. And so I don't want to create that automatic pressured response. So we say, what if? And the idea here is that we're literally trying to rewire that automatic response so that now when you actually encounter situations, you have more options automatically. Not, your automatic response is to think, well, there are other ways to do this. I've seen it. In the Giving Voice to Values cases, I've seen people who found ways to deal with this issue. Or in my discussions with my colleagues of the Giving Voice to Values case, we've generated new ideas, new scripts, new ways to respond to the objections that we might encounter. And so what we've done is we've literally created, like I say, we've rewired your automatic connection. We've given you more arrows in your quiver. You have more tools at your disposal, and you feel more practiced, more able to use them. And so that's why we call it a thought experiment, where we just say, what if you were going to do this? I would never ask you, what will you do, until I've actually helped you think of options so that you actually feel like you have some choices. So that's the Giving Voice to Values thought experiment. Once we came up with that idea, we created hundreds of pieces of material, cases all based on real situations. Sometimes they're composites, but they're disguised. They often feature people who did find a way to act on their values. And sometimes people tried and failed. And if they failed, then the GVV question is, well, what could they have done that might have worked better? So what we're asking people to do is to brainstorm an action plan and pre-script different positive ways of responding to these situations. It's not like there's some sort of magic bullet. What you're using are the skills you already have, the skills of problem solving, the skills of finding allies, the skills of reframing challenges, the skills of negotiations, power and influence. We're asking you to use all the skills that you already have. But unfortunately, when we frame an issue as ethics or values, often we forget about all our skills. We sort of dumb ourselves down and we just sort of react. And it's a sense that we feel like we don't have choices. In fact, we tend to generalize from the negative and we tend to see positive examples as the exception. And so what we're trying to do here is give people more positive examples so that we can reframe that automatic response. So we created all these pieces of material. There's cases, there's readings, there's book series, we have books on how to do this in law, how to do this in medicine, how to do this in accounting, how to do this in sales and marketing. And so we have books and we have a MOOC through Coursera and we have interactive online modules. And we put all this stuff out there. Much of it's available for free. And we asked people to experiment with it because we didn't know if people would find it useful. And we've frankly been kind of shocked by how fast people have taken this up and how many people have taken this up. There's lots of reasons for that, I think. I think some of it is because many of us would like to act on our values. We just don't know how. And we love the idea of getting better at it. I think it's also been attractive to people because it's not about thou shalt not. Usually when we talk about ethics, we think about it as what you can't do, constraints on action. And that's not all that appealing to people especially people in business, who are trying to build enterprises and develop new products and services and make money and be successful and climb the career ladder. And so all these thou shalt nots are not that attractive. But what giving voice to values is more aspirational. It's about, I want to help you do what you want to do. We're starting from the premise that most of us would like to act on our values if we thought we could do it successfully. And so we're trying to help people feel more able to do that. We're also trying to build a conversation. When you have these discussions about the GVV thought experiments, you're allowed to have a conversation with your peers about how to do the right thing without feeling like you sound naive or without feeling like you sound unrealistic, because we've actually given you the task, the assignment of trying to think creatively about how could you get the right thing done. So we've given you kind of a safe space, cover to have that conversation and to not feel like it makes you look unsophisticated. So we did all that. And then, like I say, it just got picked up. It's literally been used on all 7 continents now, even the Antarctic. And we've done a lot of work in India. It's been one of the first places that I got to take it when we were developing it. I still tell lots of stories about my experiences in India, which were wonderful. And I'd be happy to share some of them in the Q&A if you like. But you've probably figured out that at its heart, giving voice to values is really just a reframe. Instead of asking what's right, we ask, how do you get the right thing done? And I'm going to conclude by saying, I'm going to leave you with the 3 giving voice to values flips, or the 3 giving voice to values reversals. So we've reversed what it is we're talking about when we talk about ethics and values in our organizations and in our lives. We've reversed who it is we think we're talking to, and we've reversed how we have the conversation. So in terms of what it is we're talking about when we talk about values and ethics in our organizations, it used to be that people would say, if you want to talk about ethics, especially in business, you shouldn't focus on the so-called clear-cut, right, wrong, black and white issues. Those are easy. You should focus on the gray issues, the issues where it's not so clear. And I used to think, yeah, that makes sense. But I've actually changed my mind, because if you only talk about the gray issues, those are issues, there's a lot of them. And I don't know what the right answer is to most of those. But those are issues where reasonable people of goodwill and intelligence can legitimately disagree. That's why they're gray. But nevertheless, there are a lot of issues where most of us, not everybody, but most of us would agree, well, that's clearly over the line. That's clearly illegal. It's clearly fraudulent. It's clearly abusive. But just because most of us might agree with that doesn't mean that we think it's possible to act on it. And so what we've decided is let's focus on those clear-cut issues, the issues where most of us would agree this is wrong. Because if we focus on the gray issues, we'll never get past the discussion about how many angels dance on the head of a pin. We'll never get past the analysis. So if we can go to the so-called clear-cut issues, we can actually get to a conversation about action, about how to talk about this, how to get it done effectively. And the other thing I've found is that if we get better at talking about the so-called black and white clear-cut issues, we actually get better at talking about the gray issues at the same time. So it actually helps us to have a more constructive conversation there. So that's the first flip, what it is we're talking about. We're focusing on issues where most of us would agree this is not what we want to do. But then the second flip is who we think we're talking to. Now, it used to be I'd go into a company or I'd go into an organization or into a classroom, and they would tell me, most of the people here are good people. We just have a few bad apples, and they're the ones that this is for. But I actually think of the audience differently. I think of the classroom or the company or the organization as a bell curve. And this is based on some research by the late Greg Dees and Peter Crampton, who researched ethics and negotiations. So I think of the organization as a bell curve. And at one tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would self-identify as opportunists. And we would define opportunists as people who would say, I will always try to maximize my material self-interest, regardless of values. Now, nobody falls into one of these categories all the time, but these are people who would say, that's my primary motivation. And at the other tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would self-identify as idealists. And we would define idealists as people who would say, I will always try and act on my values, regardless of the impact on my own self-interest. What we premise is that the majority of us fall under the bell. I put myself there, and we call them pragmatists. And we define pragmatists as people who would say, I would like to act on my values, as long as it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage. Now, that's not the same as saying, as long as I know I'll never pay a price. It's not the same as saying, as long as I know I'll succeed. It simply means I think I have a chance. I think I have a shot. Now, if you think of your audience that way, I don't think I have the power to change the opportunists. I think they'll always be with us. And I'm not so worried about the idealists, except I want them to be more skillful and more competent. But we're really focusing on the pragmatists, and we're saying we want to give you the skills. We want to give you the literal scripts. We want to give you the positive examples and the rehearsal, the peer coaching, the practice to be who you already want to be at your best. We're not trying to change you. We're not trying to constrict you. We're trying to enable you. We're trying to help you be who you want to be at your best. And our premise is that if enough of the pragmatists and the idealists become more skillful at this, more confident at this, more competent at this, develop this muscle memory, this habit, it changes the water then that the opportunists are swimming in. So the calculus that they do to determine what's in their self-interest is got to change, because they cannot rely on the same level of silent complicity from everybody else. So that's how we've reframed who it is we're talking to when we talk about GVV. And the final flip is how we have the conversation. And I've already described that to you. Instead of focusing on what's right, we focus on how do you get the right thing done? And we give you the opportunity to rehearse and prescript and peer coach. So that's GVV in a nutshell. I'm going to stop there. I think we have time for a few questions. I would love to talk to you about how different organizations have used this, or if you want to hear about how we've used it in different parts of the world, or if you just have questions about the whole approach, or if you in fact have suggestions about how we can expand it and make it better. I would be very open to that. And I'm going to turn it back to Nisigandha and ask you to moderate the Q&A if you don't mind. But yeah, thank you
I'll do that. I request people to raise a hand so that I can call upon. Yeah, Nilanjana is raising hand, and others can just raise hand in the web platform itself. Yeah, Nilanjana first. You are muted, Nilanjana. Yeah.
Now is it okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Mary. It was a wonderful discussion. It was an honor hearing from
Thank you.
I'm a student of psychology, human rights law. I shifted. So I grew up on Bandura and Carl Gustav Jung and Freud and all that. And I shifted to human rights law. My question is, I'm more concerned with the social, spiritual, and ethereal aspects, if I may, of, if you will, of values in the classroom, how we use values to determine disposition and behavior, and the spiritual, the social, and the ethereal aspects of values, how they may be used to reform society. My most recent book was called There's Love in Every Heart. It dealt with the intrinsic goodness that is in it. This is part of every individual, every human being. And I said that no to capital punishment. I said no to draconian laws. And I said even the most hardcore criminal can be reformed. Could you please throw some light, enlighten us about the social and the ethereal and the spiritual reform aspects of values, ma'am? Mary?
Well, so it's kind of a broad question. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking, but what I would say is that one of the premises of giving voice to values, I didn't talk about this, but it's based on 7 pillars. And the first pillar is values. And it's, often people will say, well, you can't really talk about values because it differs for everyone. It differs from their spiritual tradition. It differs from their religious tradition. It differs from their geographic or national experience, political experiences, family experiences, all of those things. And so they'll say values are entirely relative. So you can't really have this conversation that you're talking about. And then other people will disagree with that and will say, no. There's a core group of values that are true for everyone. And I know what they are, and I don't really care what you think because I know what's right, okay? Either one of those positions, an entirely relativistic position or an entirely absolutist position, kind of precludes the conversation I'm talking about, where people will raise these issues and actually hopefully come to some agreement. But what we need to do is to look at the research, and we know from the research that there do tend to be a set of values that are universally shared across culture, across time, across religions. People may name them differently, but they're a very high level set of values. The philosophers call them hypernorms. And they're things like compassion or respect or integrity or fairness, right? So the good news is that there is this common ground of core values they're part of what's enabled us to survive as a species, as human beings. But then the other news is that it's a really, really short list, okay? And so what we always tell people when they're trying to confront a values conflict is that the first question is to ask, does this rise to the level of one of these core values? Is this something that really addresses integrity or compassion or fairness? Or is it more just my own personal comfort level, my own personal politics or religious background that might not be, it might be something where we may agree to disagree. And so we ask ourselves that question. Now, if it rises to that level of one of these core human values, these hypernorms, then we try and raise it, but we try and frame it in a way that we're using a language that will communicate to everyone, that we're using a language that appeals to the value that we're likely to share, rather than using the language that comes from my religion or my politics or my family background, whatever it may be. So we are able to find the place where there's possible to have this agreement. And then we also are thinking about how do we communicate about it in a way that people will hear it. So I think that connects somewhat to your points about spiritual traditions. But I think that the idea is to find a way to be able to talk across them. In fact, one of our first cases in the Giving Voice to Values collection was written by a faculty member in India. She was a professor at the Goa Institute of Management. And it was actually a case that had to do with some conflict between a Muslim and a Hindu, a Muslim business owner and the Hindu population where his business was located. And so they had to find a way to connect across that difference around a value that they could both agree to. So I don't know if that addresses your question, but that's how I think about that issue.
Yeah. We'll talk about it later, Nilanjana. I think the kind of spiritual values that you are talking about is more about hyper-norms. So we'll have a separate conversation. So Shweta.
Good evening, Marie. It's a very informative session. I just want to listen some Indian story from you. And I have one doubt. Will ethnicity play any role in ethics? Like, will it vary from country to country?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll tell you a story to answer. When I first created Giving Voice to Values, one of the first group to invite me to come was the National Entrepreneurship Network of India. And they invited me to come and do a 2-day program in Delhi and another one in Bangalore. And it was with Indian entrepreneurs and faculty who taught entrepreneurship to Indians. And so I came in, the same thing happened in both cities. I came in on the first morning, there were a group of people sitting in the classroom, and they were all adults, right? And they're all sitting in their chairs, leaning back in their chairs with their arms crossed, sort of smirking at me, you know? And I was like, uh-oh. So I said, what's wrong? You know, what's going on? And they were all very, quiet. Then finally, one brave soul raised his hand and he said, "Madam, we're happy you're here. We're delighted to listen to you talk about giving voice to values. But you have to understand, we are entrepreneurs and this is India. And we can't even get a driver's license without paying a bribe. So this is not going to be relevant to us. But we're very happy to listen to you. And thank you so much for coming all the way from the United States." So I thought, okay, so I thought this is what I'm going to be dealing with, right? But what happened is I found there were 5 things that I had to do in order to work with this group. And they've become useful to me all over the world, different ethnicities, different countries, etc. So the first thing I had to do was I had to acknowledge the reality of the context. I had to acknowledge the reality of what he was saying. So I said, look, this is not my first trip to India. I've been here. I think at that point I'd been there like 10 times in different cities. And I said, and I know what you're saying, there's some truth to it. I've experienced it myself, not driver's licenses, but other times when people were trying to pressure me for bribes, etc. And I said, so I know it's true, but so you acknowledge the reality. But I also know it's not something that you're happy about all the time, So then the second point was you have to start from a position of respect. And so I would say, look, I'm not Mary Gentile here from Boston to tell you what your values should be. I know you have values. I know that you're not happy about having to pay a bribe to be able to get the policeman to let you drive to pick up your kid at school because he says you were speeding even though you weren't. I know that you're not happy about that. And so I know you have values. What I'm here is to try and help you find a way to act on your values, given the reality of the context you live and work in, which is different than the context that I live and work in. But you do have values, and they're often the same values, right? And then the third thing so that's starting from a place of respect. First, you acknowledge the reality of the context. Second, you start from a place of respect. The third thing I do is I explain to them about what the Giving Voice to Values thought experiment is. The same thing I explained to you all a minute ago, which is I tell them, look, I'm not going to give you a situation and say, what would you do? I'm going to give you a situation where someone knows they don't want to pay the bribe, for example, and ask you, how could they be successful? So what this does is it brings the pressure down. People don't feel on the spot in the same way. And it also allows them to think more creatively, to be more, to brainstorm more ideas because you've taken down the pressure. And then the fourth thing I do is I always try and have an example of someone from the culture, the region, the religion, the part of the world that I'm operating in who did this effectively. So I can share an example. And in this case, I had a video of an Indian entrepreneur who had purchased a company from one of the major multinationals. It was a company based in India, but it sold packaged foods, Indian foods, but to the West, to the US and Australia. And when this Indian entrepreneur purchased this company, it was near bankruptcy. It was pretty corrupt. And it was in violation even of the Indian labor laws, right? So it was a sick company in many ways. And in the space of a couple of years, this entrepreneur turned it around to be quite successful financially, but also to be seen as a model of clean operating. And so I had stories of the things he had done. I had these little video vignettes where he would pose a challenge and then talk about how he addressed it. And so what that does is it actually, it appeals to a sense of pride in your audience because you've shared an example of someone from their region, their culture, their religion, their whatever, their industry who has done this. So that triggers that sense of pride, but it also triggers a little bit of competition, right? Because if he could do it, why can't I do it, right?
Motivation.
Yeah. And then the fifth thing that I try to do is I have to explain, especially in cultures like China and some of the very high authority cultures, I have to explain that the voice in giving voice to values is a metaphor. So it doesn't mean going to your boss and telling him or her that they're all wrong. You know, it may mean asking questions. It might mean talking to someone who talks to someone who has the ear of the decision maker. It might mean gathering some new data. It might mean writing a memo. It might mean creating a set of allies and doing something jointly. So in other words, I help people understand that it doesn't mean, you know, yelling at your boss, you know, it's something much more nuanced than that. Once I do those 5 things, I find that there's a real appetite for this because people feel respected and they, you know, people do want to be able to act on their values. So that going back to that class in Delhi and Bangalore, once I explained all this, they really got into it. And they all, you know, they would be working on the scenarios and they would lapse into Hindi. So fortunately, I had asked a friend of mine who lives in India to come co-teach with me so she could whisper in my ear what they were saying, you know, and people really got into the creative problem solving. And just I'll add one little story. This was years ago. This was maybe 7 years ago. This morning, I got an email from a woman who was in that program who said, I was in your program in Delhi with the National Entrepreneurship Network of India, and I'm now running an entrepreneurship development program in Uttar Pradesh, and I want to bring GVV into it. So it, you know, it stays with people because they feel empowered and enabled. So it's kind of a long story, but I think it gets to your question about how do you do this across culture? So thank you, Swetha.
Yeah, thank you so much for.
Thank you.
Dhananjay?
Good evening, Professor. Thank you
evening.
very much, first of all, for your kind words of wisdom and experience that you've shared today. A little bit of apologies from my side. While I joined the meeting, there was a noise from background coming from my side.
Oh.
So apologies for that as well.
That's okay. I just waited till you muted.
Yes, ma'am. And ma'am, I happen to be a student of Professor Nisigandha presently. And, we have
Okay.
learned a lot from her. So I just have one question for you, ma'am. While you were discussing about the bell curve and while you were like differentiating between the idealists, the opportunists, and the pragmatics, what I happen to be in the majority of the bell curve where I also treat myself as pragmatists only. The only thing is like I happen to come from the Indian Navy, ma'am. I have served in 12 years in the Indian Navy. Now I have come for my MBA here. So what I used to see is like our senior leaders, our admirals in the Navy, they used to be mostly the idealists. And what I felt in the Navy is that it was always like a conflicting situation. While they expected a lot out of me, that I should follow the core values to the, at the very, like every bit of it. And somehow I used to fall in those I never used to fall in those bracket of expectations. I still am in a dilemma how to deal with it. So could you share some experiences, like how do you actually become, part of those good books of those seniors who are expecting a lot out of you?
So just to make sure I understand, the question is, you felt like they didn't think you were complying with what they wanted you to do, or they didn't think you were performing at a high enough level? What was the problem?
It's like they had a lot of expectations, like they are following all the values and maybe I'm not. So
Yeah,
they had higher and I was not doing maybe.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I understand. Yeah, I've done some work with the military in the US, and I can see what you're talking about. There's a set of high standards. In fact, there's some research that they've done in the US for the US Army. And it was a couple of scholars at the Army War College in the US. And they've done research to show that the level of lying in the military, in the Army, is much higher than they thought it would be. But when they dug deeper to understand why, they realized it was because the requirements, the standards that they were asking these military enlisted individuals to comply with were unrealistic. They were asking them to do so many things that they didn't have the time or the resources to do. And so they would end up lying just because it was the only way to survive. And it sounds like it's a little bit similar to what you're talking about, where maybe some of the expectations are unrealistic. And even when you're trying, it might lead people to, give up or to deceive or to just be discouraged. So that depends, of course, on the personalities of the individuals who are setting these standards. But the one idea that I would share with you that I've tried to use when I've encountered bosses who were really demanding and not happy with me is to try and make it clear to them that I want to learn to be able to meet their standards. So in other words, to say, I'm sorry that this, hasn't satisfied you, but I really want to. Can you help me address identify where I need to improve? Or can you refer me to someone who you think can help me if you're too busy? Or if you can refer. So in other words, you have established with them that you are not being obstinate and you're not, failing to meet their standards on purpose because you don't care. And it's not because you're not smart enough or talented enough, but that you just need to learn to do what they want you to do. And so I think if you can try offering that as, positioning yourself as someone who really wants to succeed in their eyes and ask for their guidance, can you help me figure out how to do this more effectively? And you have to be sure that you're clarifying that they don't have to do it personally, because if they're in a position higher than you in the hierarchy, they may feel like they're too busy. So you might say, who could I go to, or who should I ask, or something like that. But I think I would try that because you want to communicate that this is not you just refusing, this is you needing to learn. And hopefully they'll begin to take a breath, because it sounds like they may be being somewhat unrealistic in what they're asking of you too. And if you present yourself as wanting to learn, that might help them take a breath, take a step back, and stop being annoyed at you, and instead see you as someone that they have a responsibility to develop. So I hope that helps a little.
Thank you, Professor. That helps.
Yeah. So seems like no more question. So thank you very much, Mary. Thank you for making it possible to speak for us. And, I'm very glad that some of my students also could attend the session. And thank you very much. We'll keep in touch and looking forward for your visit to MCHV again.
I look forward to that as well. It was great to talk to you all. Take care. Have a good
Okay.
evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening.